We're very pleased to welcome Elizabeth Churchill as our opening keynote. She is the Director of User Experience at Google and Vice President of the ACM, our sponsoring professional society. Throughout her career, she has led research groups at eBay, Yahoo, Park, and FXPAL, served on the SIG-Chi Executive Committee in a number of SIG-Chi leadership roles, and as well as other ACM roles, such as last term as the Secretary-Treasurer. So, Elizabeth, thank you very much for joining us.
So, the first thing that I want to say about recommendations is that if you're going to have a title, don't put a number in it. Because I called mine 5 E's, right? And I cannot tell you how many people suggested more E's. So, the first thing we're going to do is redefine how many E's there are. Once this worked perfectly, like just 20 minutes ago, didn't it? There we go, 5 E's. In fact, no, 6 E's. It went up to about 7 E's, and then the final one, which is your friends have terrible jokes, because I'm an Elizabeth, more E's. So the first recommendation I have for you is don't use numbers. Here are the E's I started with. These E's are expedient, which means convenient and practical. The next E is exigent, which is pressing and demanding. So we talk about the exigencies of the city, of city life, which might be commuting. It's the things that are pressed upon you. Explainable was just mentioned, which is understandable or intelligible. And, of course, there is a call for explainable AI, and I'll mention that in passing because I want to focus on people mostly today. Then there's equitable, fair and impartial, and there'll be a little flavor of that as I go forward. And finally, there's ethical, which is morally good or correct. And really, this talk is sort of some thoughts that I've been having after I was invited to come here, and it's really about a provocation for some conversations I'd love to have with folks here or, listen to. But the real takeaway is that even in our lives every day, because of the contexts in which we work and because of the needs and demands that we have, we often act expediently because it's practical and convenient, and it's the next obvious thing to do. Langdon Winner, who is a cultural commentator, often talks about the technological imperative, which is we build what we can build because we can. It is sort of expedient to do so. There might be pressure upon us to do so, or maybe it's expedient just because it's the next obvious thing to do from within the perspective that we have. It might be exigent to do what we do, because of the context in which we work and the pressures we feel there. But ultimately, we have to take responsibility to think about whether what we're building actually has a bigger picture of being equitable or ethical. And I think explainable AI, for example, sort of sits somewhere in that. So that's the real takeaway. So if you haven't had caffeine yet and you think you'd like to run out and get some now, you can go out for the next 30 minutes or so while I talk about a few things and come back and I'll say the same thing again. Okay. So the other E that somebody gave me that I actually liked out of the possibly 10 or so actually I got was enigma. What we don't want to do is provide technologies that are puzzling or inexplicable or create puzzling or inexplicable situations. So this is the one E I don't want. So I just want to throw that one out. Because, it's always good to have what you don't want as well as what you do, right? A bit of figure ground. So this is the overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm just going to give you some delights just to remind us of the good things, because, there's a lot of talking about the bad things. There's a little bit of trouble in paradise, just for some context. And then I'm going to talk about 3 design lenses, if you want, that I've been thinking about. One is design for people, and really understanding human decision and action, thinking about collaboration and conversation, and considering the nature of explanation. Then I want to think about complexity and the design for complex systems, from applications to complex socio-technical, not just technical, but socio-technical systems. And I want to call us all to thinking about designing for failure. Because we know that all complex systems fail at some point. But how do we understand how to recover from failure? And how do we define what failure looks like? And then there's designing for context. And this is really my call to action, which is, you may feel that you don't have a lot of power. You might not be, the CEO of a major corporation, a major social media corporation, for example. So you might feel you don't have a lot of power to change things. But as many of us know, actually being CEO of a major corporation often means that you don't have a lot of agency in the moment. You might have a lot of power to move large structures along, but you don't have a lot of agency in the moment. And I want to say that every person in this room has a lot of agency to change what we're building and how we build it, and to engage with ethics. And, those might be small moments in your workplace, but that's what I really want us to walk away from. How can we have agency to make sure we're doing the right things? And I'll have a few parting thoughts. So, delight. I'm sure we all love these kinds of interactions and interfaces that we use. How many people looked up the weather before they came here? Yay! That was the first thing I did. You can see Vancouver weather. I love suggestions. I think suggestions are absolutely fantastic. And I want to delight in that. I also happen to love damn you autocorrect. Anyone else in this room like damn you autocorrect? You should look it up. I have a little story to tell you. Sort of autocorrect and completion when you're texting somebody. A friend of mine, broke up with his girlfriend. Unfortunately, they're back together now, not that long ago. And he was texting her, and they have a shared puppy. And he wrote to her in this moment of conciliation, don't worry, he meant to write, I will exercise the dog. What she received was, don't worry, I will execute the dog. Luckily, they repaired the situation. And that's another point. It was because she knew him well enough to know and to trust that that would not have been what he wrote. So knowing each other really matters. The bigger context within which to interpret something. I personally always love to go back to group lens work and movies and the movie recommendations, which blew my mind when it first started, right? I love Netflix. I love that I can separate myself from the other people on my account, but I still get some really odd things. Netflix seems to think I have a very dark sensibility. I'm always being recommended the dark, the death and mayhem. I'm going to actually just start watching rom-coms just so that my profile changes. Music. A friend of mine came over and was cooking with me, and she is obsessed with Serge Gainsbourg. And now I'm always being recommended Serge Gainsbourg. So we've all had these delights, right? Books. Love the books recommendations. I happen to love shoes. I love being recommended shoes. This is John Fluvog, who I believe is a Vancouver designer, right? Is that right? Canadian. Most of these are high use by me and probably by you, and they're pretty low consequence. And even like the example of the friend with his girlfriend, they're easily recovered, especially with context when things go wrong. But there is some trouble in paradise that frustrates people. Here is one of my favorite Twitch streams, as I call it. Anyone else follow this one? Oh, yeah. I won't swear out loud. And I have actually covered out that swear word. But big data can't figure out I already bought those bleep pair of shoes on the exact website that's showing me shoes incessantly. I am not obsessed with shoes, Amazon. Do you read me? I personally am, but this person isn't. So we get things wrong, but again, low consequence. I had a great thing when I was working at eBay, which was, we did a study because we had people signed up for a diary study and they'd given consent for us to track what they were looking at. And this is a sort of illustration of where our stereotypes are also a bit kind of out of whack. We couldn't understand this search history, which involved guns, bullets, and diapers. There was an extensive series of children's clothes, baby clothes, and ammunition. So we went and interviewed the people concerned, and, you know, you sort of think about it, we were shocked because we were imposing stereotypes that those things don't go together. But they might go together. In this instance, it was a couple who were just sharing one account, the opposite of the Netflix example, right, where there are different accounts. But that really struck me, and it struck me because my reasoning process of being surprised was actually really revealing a whole load of cultural stereotypes that I had. Turned out that the cultural stereotypes were reinforced, but it didn't change my reasoning process as being not that great as a designer reflector. And those moments are really well worthwhile. This is less lightweight. I'm sure we've seen all of this news about autocorrect changing the names of drugs. And, you know, people potentially being harmed because they're sort of typing in drugs. And remember, they're low expertise around these arcane medical terms for drugs. And so you look something up that looks kind of like that random assortment of letters called whatever it is, dufloxetine or whatever. And it looks kind of like it because, you know, humans tend to kind of be like, I can't quite spell that, but it's sort of vaguely right. And then you end up with a medication regime recommended to you that might actually be very harmful. Again, human reasoning comes in, and you're sort of being prompted, and there's a sort of recognition memory going on here, rather than an explicit recall memory. And as a non-expert, you might kind of think, oh, well, I guess they maybe spell it many different ways. This is in the hands of people who don't need to be experts at this, but we might be misleading. And so, more complex trouble in paradise. These are all kinds of headlines we've all been seeing. You see why I started with the positive stuff? Because this stuff is heavy and difficult and really important and sort of unexpected. And it's because the content that is filtered or recommended or shown to us is within a particular socio-technical, a social context, and that we did not predict that these are the kinds of things that were going to happen. There is a lot of concern right now about racial profiling. And it's not that, you know, profiling is necessarily ethically wrong, but when it gets within a context of its application of a particular set of discriminatory behaviors or practices or a particular set of assumptions about how people should behave, it can be seriously problematic. So, you know, many of our colleagues, very smart people like Ricardo Bezer-Yates, and I suspect many people in this room have already started thinking about this and talking about this and theorizing around it and practically applying skills to think about, for example, the biases that come in with the data that we're actually looking at. Then there's the biases of processing, like my bias in processing the babies and bullets, my stereotypes. And Ricardo has some, this is a paper from a few months ago, but I'm sure, how many people have read this? There's a few of you. I thought this was really rather good. I really enjoyed all of this being in one place. I thought it was very nicely done. Because there are many different kinds of bias, and the more literate we can be in terms of our biases and how we inscribe them into systems, the better we're going to do. So self-selection bias, interaction bias, second-order biases, sampling biases. You know, the more we get literate about these different kinds of ways in which we're sort of shifting attention or creating salience or relevance, the better we're going to do. And I really do recommend taking a look at this article. I thought it was really good. We also have had calls recently for the explainable AI that was mentioned earlier, and to get rid of the black boxes. What's most disturbing for me anyway, and I'm sure for many people in the room, is that, you know, the black box is often like a black box even to us when we build the black box. And that is concerning. It's concerning when we don't worry about that as we launch whatever we've built. Again, there's some really nice material in here, but I just started reading this, the Book of Why. How many folks have been reading this? I think this is splendid. I'm only about a third of the way through it. But what I like about this is that Judea Pearl, who's, you know, a Turing Award winner, is saying, what we did before was good, but it was sort of not quite right. Maybe we need to do something different. Maybe we need to have systems that think like people. And maybe we need to think about causal, not just correlational models. And he takes his lead from human reasoning, this idea of association, where, you know, you're seeing and observing, intervention, where you're doing, and then there's imagining, and imagining what the what if. And really my talk today is about lovely humans in this room, us bringing our imagining to how we can do explainable AI, what will work, what won't work, but how we can imagine the consequences of what we build. And I'll have some exercises that I do with my teams to share later. So I've given you some delight. I've given you some context. I've given you some hope from some incredibly smart members of our community. And I'd like to invite everybody in this room, if you have thoughts and reflections beyond this, beyond my current reading, I'd like to hear it, but I'd like us to all share with each other. Because in my introduction, and thank you for that lovely introduction, you know, my belief in community is that we can actually do better if we critique each other in the positive design sense of the word critique, which is help each other build better systems. So with that, I have three things. Design for people is the first. All right, so here's the word recommend. It's our word of the day. It's our word for this conference. It's our word for this discipline. What does the word mean? My first invitation, I guess maybe it's about my fifth invitation actually so far. I'm always like, you know, inviting people to do things. Is what does this word mean? Because meanings matter. Here are some other ways in which humans interact with information and with each other. We discuss things. We reason about things. We decide. We opine. We have opinions. Maybe some of the recommender systems you've been working on are actually just giving opinions, not recommendations. Maybe they're actually instructions because the recipient, like the people who are looking up the drug names, is looking for some way to take the next step forward, to be instructed to the next step. Maybe you're just informing. Maybe you're explaining. Maybe you're bluffing. All of these are human exchanges and human interactions which are about information exchange in order for somebody to take an action. Me buying shoes is non-consequential most of the time. Me being nudged by a piece of information that's presented, HCI always talks about the right information in the right mode in the right time. You know, maybe I'm just being nudged towards doing something because this thing has appeared in my presence that's recommended to me, a bit like an ad on the side of me looking something else up. But I want us to look at all of these words, and I want us to think that when we have a piece of information that has been recommended to us, how is the recipient taking that information? What is their cognitive, social, information exchange state? What is their decision-making and reasoning state? Because something that comes in as a command is very different for how I'm going to act than something which is a recommendation. So I would argue, when I read about recommendations from recommendation systems, they have more or less weight depending on the context in which I receive them and the context in which they are presented. So I want to look at human reasoning. Here is an ideal model of human reasoning. You identify a problem, I need some shoes. You establish decision criteria, got to be flat shoes because I'm going to be running for the bus a lot. You weigh the decision criteria. Maybe not completely flat, maybe just a couple of inches of heel. Maybe that'll do. You generate alternatives. It could be sneakers, it could be those. There are high heel sneakers now. Did you know that? Seriously, seriously. You evaluate the alternatives. Comfy high heel sneakers, flat sneakers. You choose the best alternative. You implement the decision and you evaluate the decision. Okay, in my shopping cart, I've got 5. I'm going to buy which ones based on other things. Now, I'm obviously using a silly example, but imagine that is actually a safety critical system and you're about to save the world. All right. This is an ideal model of human behavior. We all know that actually, here is Cialdini's bestseller, Influence. So many people have bought this book because they know that there are certain rules that you can implement to persuade somebody to do something, even when they don't know they want to do it or they think they're going to do something completely different. So human reasoning is affected by persuasion. Then you've got Thinking Fast and Slow, which is another great book. Kahneman, Tversky, Nobel Prize, blah, 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 human reasoning biases, fantastic. So many biases, I'm surprised I managed to get out of bed every morning, actually. But, you know, we're affected by other things. Nudge, also, another prize winner. You know, human reasoning, there's conscious processing, that lovely decision circle, and then there's all the unconscious stuff that's going on. And we know, for example, lots of research shows that when you go to a posh restaurant and the prices are higher and the menu is beautifully laid out, you can be served the same food, but you will rate it higher. Same food, rate it higher. And you're not being asked about your experience, you're being asked, how did it taste? There are millions of examples of these. And this is apparently a city of fabulous restaurants, high and low end. So I invite you to go and try this out. So those words, input, changes how we think. Trust and authority changes how we think. People who enact confidence, people who have power over you, people you respect, you're going to see a recommendation from somebody that you consider to be in some way subordinate as a suggestion. You're going to see a recommendation stated very certainly by somebody who has power over you as basically a command. So human biases, human reasoning, it's variable by expertise. If you're a novice at something, like the drugs I mentioned, versus an expert, your mental model, the way you evaluate input is going to be different. If you're a discretionary user of an app, my shopping apps, I'm a discretionary user. It's very different from if this is an absolutely required and critical application. And the weird thing is that for us in this room, something that looks discretionary and non-consequential might, because of the context in which it is placed, be absolutely required and critical for somebody else. And the only way you're going to know the difference is by going and studying people and understanding deeply the socio-technical presence of what you've built. So, is something that you're building, is the recommendation system that you're affecting the end result, with which you're affecting an end result, is it discretionary and casual or required and critical? Is it for an expert or a novice? Is it for someone who's paying attention or someone who's on autopilot? Because all of the research on naturalistic decision-making in everyday suggests that that beautiful, clean model doesn't really work. So you're now trying to leave home to get to work. You've got to decide which route you're going on. You've got your map thing going. You've got 3 kids. The bathroom just flooded. Somebody just phoned you because you've got some disaster going on. People are operating in these contexts all the time. They're not full, focused, cognitive frontal brain action. They're actually distracted. And they're taking information in as they can. And do you know how many people end up in lakes because they listen? They listen to the mapping, the sat-nav or whatever it is, and they're not paying attention. It says turn left, and you turn left, and you're suddenly in a lake. And I want to be really clear. People are not stupid. They're distracted. They're not paying attention because they have also given up some control because of trust. They trust the system to steer them right. Here's another one. This is what shopping looks like in that rational model. Plan, da-da, checkout, whatever. I was thinking about what state people usually shop in. How many people in this room, I'm sorry, if you're not a drinker, forgive me for asking this. I'll ask you, if it's your Gideon high on life. How many people in this room might have had a drink or two and then gone shopping? Yeah, one person confessed, and I see you. I just want to say that Canada's drunk shopping habit has hit 724 million. I'm very excited about being in Canada at the moment, because you people seem to be fun. But, it's affected by state. And it's not just, an intoxicated state. It's affected by mood. You're really worried about your parent, and you're driving, and you're thinking about your parent because that is what matters to you. And suddenly you're in a lake. You're looking at, something that's come up, recommendation, and, you're worrying about, how you're going to pay the bills next week. This is the exigency of human life, right? Also, as designers of interfaces, we know that perceptual salience is changed by how we design something. This is taken from Ricardo's article. My career has been spent, in large part, designing information to be salient in what I consider to be the right moment in the right way at the right time. We are driving people to look at things, and we are and how we think about whether people have the other context for evaluating that information. We're changing it depending on how they interact with it visually. And, with augmented reality, we've got depth, which is about salience and importance. Where is some information placed? Is it placed upon something else? Your recommendation, our recommendation, if it's placed upon a particular thing, very worrying about where it might be placed for how it's interpreted. And as we get more and more devices that are interacting with our bodies more and more, where does a recommendation get placed on our bodies? And how does that affect the level of importance it is given and the extent to which somebody feels they can resist and or interpret and or question? So physiologically, we have to think about how that placement, the context, all the way from the body to the everyday exigencies of a life, how it is interpreted. And I think that's just super interesting. Okay. So, if that was sort of the human perspective, I want to think about systems and systems of systems. So, a lot of really, really, really brilliant people I talk to, we get so wrapped up in our own thing that, this is the tech thinking. Ooh, interesting technique, what can I throw it at? Here's a solution space. Has anybody in this room had a conversation that goes something like this? I just learned this new thing, this new technique, and do you know what? I think there's this problem that we can try at that because, and then they give you this scenario that is so completely arcane. It's like, so I really like watching movies, but I also like playing games. So what I think I'm going to do is see if I can build something that will recommend to me a movie that has a character that's just like this character that I played in that game, because I think I know how to solve that problem. So it's like, I know how to solve the problem that I just kind of made up because I've got this great technique, and it's like a hammer, and I'm going to use it. And you just sit and you scratch your head and you say, does anybody really want that? Well, I think that pure, for the want of the word pure, but Science at the technical level of can you push a technique further may progress like that. The imagining of how you tweak something to push it to the next level. How you break something to fix it to do something that might be different. And I think that that's incredibly creative and really, really important. And we should not stop that. I think taking a hammer apart to figure out if the pieces could be reconfigured in order to make a piano might be a little bit beyond, but worth trying. It's worth trying, and it's really important, but it should not be mistaken for a product. I was going to show you a clip from Jurassic Park, but I decided I'll show you all later. It's this part where they're sitting. How many people have seen Jurassic Park? Do you know what it is? Yay! Well, it's this place, this lunch that they're all having, where everyone is sitting around, and you've got your business person, your legal person, your dreamer CEO, and they're all talking about. You've got your scientists, and they're all talking about how great it would be to create this park. And then, one of the scientists basically kind of goes, you've got the chaos theory person, which is, I think, Jeff Goldblum. And, Jeff Goldblum's basically saying, you do know that dinosaurs and humans didn't coexist, and you might be, creating a nightmare. And there's this point which is, where he makes, which is like, what you people have done is you've stood on the shoulders of giants who produced a brilliant technology, and you didn't think about its application or its context, and you built something that we all know the end of Jurassic Park goes badly wrong. So I don't want to say don't do your tinkering and don't work out how to create a dinosaur. What I am saying is that the solution space of creating a dinosaur might not be in the socio-technical space of useful things. It might not even be a problem space because maybe a few people want to see your dinosaurs, but not that many. So in design thinking, this idea that the solution space is something that is sitting within a problem space that has a socio-technical, and I would say ethical purpose, or socio-technical use, utility, and desirefulness, whatever the word is really important. Now, it's really hard for us to do this because we're all in this world of this application, and we might kind of look further to software engineering. But once you start to think about systems engineering, it's hard to not be compelled by the expediencies and exigencies of your everyday life, to not stick within the application system area, and to think about the systems engineering at all levels. And there are different kinds of systems, as everybody in this room knows, I'm sure, but sometimes I think we mistake one for the other. There's a technical computer-based system, a word processor to write a book, and there's a socio-technical system, which I've been talking about, which is the whole system, including the business and the people and the production and, all of that, the promotion of producing a book. And I suspect many people in this room have produced books. And these socio-technical systems are hard to predict. Emergent properties, they're non-deterministic. They have complex relationships with overlapping and possibly competing objectives. I would argue that social media sites, which claim the objective is primarily about putting people in touch with each other for love and fluffy bunny reasons, a competing objective is filtering people so that they see certain things. And where that tension, how it gets resolved, is really hard. I'm not saying it's easy. But there is dispersed oversight with such systems. So what that makes us feel like is, oh, it's too hard, I can't be bothered. But actually, we have to be bothered. We really do. And we can't solve it alone, and we can't build our applications and be alone, and we can't just be excited about our technical prowess and how it has created a new experience. We do need to be in conversation with each other about whether we're actually creating Jurassic Park. So I think it was Merton, a sociologist in the 30s. We talk a lot about unintended consequences now. And Merton's 3 types of unintended consequences were unexpected benefit. I've got cash down there. Who knew that putting a bunch of people in touch with each other was going to make a bunch of billionaires? There are others. I'm trying to think of what other really amazingly shocking inventions have there been that have made people a lot of money. Any thoughts? Yeah, go and think about it. But there's things where you just go, I had no idea that was going to take off. Then there's unexpected drawbacks. So airbags, great example. Airbags are all about safety. But unfortunately, a lot of children got harmed, and women, actually, of smaller frame. That was an unexpected drawback. And drawback sounds a little bit too, doesn't sound grave enough for the consequences, but I mean it to be grave. And then there's what Merton, in his 1930s phrasing, called a perverse result. And one could argue that what we're seeing with considerations around democracy and so forth, and discussions and hate groups right now, is a perverse result. But I'm arguing that we cannot call it perverse, because to call it perverse makes us not feel responsible. It's just like, I had no idea that was going to happen. Actually, we need to think through how these things do come about, because we have enough examples from socio-technical and systems engineering to know that failures and perverse results will occur. So let's think about them. And so as I'm coming to sort of wrapping up, my last sort of phrase for this is that we cannot afford to be the monkeys who don't see, don't hear, and don't speak. Because the context in which we work, as I've been suggesting, really, we can affect it. We do have agency. And so, I talked about human reasoning being this ideal model. Organizations also have been characterized as making decisions like this. How many people think that organizations actually operate in this very logical fashion? Oh, good, nobody. There's this fantastic, I was reading a book by Charles Perrow on normal accidents. And he talks about all accidents and all failures as being kind of inevitable. You can't quite predict when they're going to happen, but you need to have a mindset that you're looking out for them. There's another theory which is, and he has a whole theory about how they sort of come about, but there's another theory which I kind of like better, and it's called the garbage can theory, which I think is a tremendous name, from the 70s. And it basically says that organizational reasoning actually looks sort of like this. People are under massive time stress. There are high stakes. So the expediency and exigency of our daily decision-making at work. Your boss says, you've got that amazing algorithm, make a dinosaur. You go, okay, well, I'll get right on the dinosaur problem. You've got multiple players. You've got legal coming from one side. You've got engineering coming from another side. Here's a classic one, working as I do currently in a design organization. Here's a beautiful animation we'd like to have happen. Engineering says, can't do that. But here's what we can do, and you suddenly get this thing that goes, so here's what we want. Here's what we end up with. And you go, no, that's not quite what I want. And so then we get a... And then the designers are like, no, I really, really, really want something. And so they up the ante. No, now I want it to do this. And the engineer is like, no, I'm done. We're doing that. And so you've got multiple players with multiple different forms of power, multiple different forms of frustration, and often different incentive models. Because organizations have incentive models for how you get promoted and how you get paid, right? And uncertainty plays into this. Vague goals. We'd like to have a park. We want dinosaurs. You've got past experience. You've got people who are a little bit more naive who are coming in. You've got people who are more junior coming in. And you've got all of the different constraints like, well, yeah, we know we said we were going to give you 3 million, but actually here's 100,000. Can you fix it? So these are all the exigencies of working in organizations or in academic contexts. You've got your best postdoc who now has got a permanent job and is leaving and is taking all the knowledge away with them, whatever your scenario might be. But this is what it's actually like to work in any kind of organization. So unsurprising that ethics and the issues of Equitable get pushed to the side, because every day the expediencies and exigencies of daily life take over. It's natural. And you've got all of these different perspective takers. And depending on your organization, often, does everybody know about the hippo? The hippo? The highest person in the organization is the one who says, no, okay, I know all of the research says we shouldn't build dinosaurs, but I want a dinosaur. Let's just have a little one, just a small dinosaur to prove the point. Right? This is what we work in. But I want us, everybody in this room, to think about how we can help each other to not be blind in those contexts, and how we can start to think. This is a lovely diagram that I use a lot, and it comes from sort of human factors and HCI. This idea that we design for the sharp end of interaction, a recommendation, but the blunt end from governments and societies really needs to be always in consideration. So wherever you're sitting, if you're an organization in here, you're an individual, you're designing for users, I want to ask you to ask yourself, is the decision you're making currently exigent? Are you acting just expediently? Are there other folks you should bring into the conversation? Can you explain why you're doing this rather than something else? And can you explain, before your system can even explain, where you think this might go? And finally, ethical. Do you feel like you've had a conversation around the extent to which what you're doing is ethical? And the thing about ethics is it's very hard. There's no good or bad. There's no right or wrong until there's a discussion. And here are some of the tools that I really like. So one of the things that I've used a lot is De Bono's 6 thinking hats. So whenever there's a decision to be made about something that might be important, think about these different hats. And I'll often also have a group looking at a particular problem or a particular application or a particular solution or a particular area. And I'll ask somebody who is currently an engineer to take a designer's perspective, because one of the things in HCI we emphasize a lot is empathy. And we talk a lot about empathy for the user, but I want us to think about empathy for the people who are, as we say, cross-functional in your team, who have other backgrounds. So I'll often ask somebody who's not in legal to be acting as legal. Somebody who's not a researcher to be a researcher. Somebody who's never done business development. Because then you get these stereotypes and assumptions about what the other person is operating on out in the open. You start to get people to take the role of the other, to empathize with why someone else might be pushing somebody or pushing a decision around a particular product or an idea. And here it could be, if you're an educator, it could be, think about this as your postdoc, think about this as your PhD student who's trying to finish. What motivations might they be under such that they are driving for a particular outcome? Is it that paper that has to get published? What are the motivations? And you might not get it right when you're taking that other role, but that's not the point. The point is to build empathy and to understand from each other's perspectives how, again, the exigencies of the roles we're in play off each other to drive towards certain solutions. And then within that, and I added ethicist, because I think that we should have ethicists on every team. And then there are these great thinking hats, which is focus on data and facts and information. Focus on feelings and gut instinct and intuition. Focus on values and benefits. Focus on difficulties and problems. And bring case studies in and try to figure out whether your thing does or does not fit. Focus on creativity and alternatives. Try and find out whether you're driving to a solution because of time pressures, and can you build in time for alternative exploration. And think about next steps, action plans. And I would say action plans includes recovery from failure, however you have defined failure from an ethical lens. So these are the sorts of exercises that we do a lot. And in my team, we do a lot of design sprints. This idea that you spend a week with a bunch of folks who have the different backgrounds working on a problem together, and you're focused together. And in the design sprint context, you can bring up these perspective takings and these thinking hats to figure out whether the solution or solutions you propose, how to weigh them against each other and weigh them against your ultimate goal. And so, I want to also put this all in the context of the ACM refreshed the Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct for the first time in 26 years. And it was a big effort, and we got a feedback probably from many people in this room, actually, so thank you for that. And it's by no means the final word, but one of the things that I think is really important and that everybody wanted in this was this idea that we should contribute to human well-being and acknowledge people, all people are stakeholders in computing. So, you know, in my group of people, the designer, the ethicist, the whatever, I'll often have people take the role of the end user from different backgrounds, from different perspectives, and try and bring different cultural perspectives on whatever we're looking at. And often those perspectives might be wrong, again, revealing stereotypes, which I mentioned earlier. And this idea that we should both professionally take responsibility for this. So we all have agency, especially in the chaotic worlds in which we live, to take up the baton, to think ethically and to move us towards ethical engagement. And I really like this last one, which is perform work only in areas of competence. Because a lot of people end up being forced into producing applications or experiences, and when you talk to them secretly, they're like, I don't really know, I haven't done this before, I'm doing my best, I'm patching it together. And that is a terrible place to put anybody in. But often within our industry culture, certainly, we will laud people who take initiative even when they don't necessarily have expertise. And I think it's our job to help people feel that they have the right to say, I can't do this. I don't feel comfortable doing this. But it's going to take a village. It's going to take all of us. And it is going to take collective, collaborative action. Because, you know, when you're the only person on the front line feeling that you're being asked to do something, you will fall to the expediencies and exigencies. But if we work on this together, I think that we can work with the ethics and work to build more equitable systems that don't cause harm. And so with that, I want to say thank you very much. And there's my monkey who's looking shocked, not covering the ears, not covering the mouth, but looking shocked. We have to engage. All right, thank you very much. I believe we have runners with mics, and we can take questions. There's also mics up here, if anyone has any questions. I was saying earlier when somebody said that there were runners with mics, one of my favorite games is a running game called Zombies Run. Has anybody played this? You're running, and you've got the sound in your ear, and you are in role as a runner, as one of the few humans left after the zombie apocalypse. And you're called a runner, and you're going to get, like, food for the human encampment that's left. So when somebody said there were mics with runners, I was like, are there zombies? Anyway, carry on. Oh, there you are.
Hello. A great talk, Elizabeth. I have a question. You said you were really in favor of scientific tinkering and, you know, tearing the hammer apart and seeing if you can build a piano. But you said that when it comes to product, we need to think differently. And I was thinking, we basically do the same when we build products, right? We experiment, we do A/B testing, we throw things at the user, see if they stick, and we optimize for a metric. And you haven't really touched upon that aspect of sort of like, is that something that you think it's part of the problem? Or how do we actually fit all of these things that are really hard to measure and to put a metric to into this kind of experimental and incremental product development cycles that all the companies, including yours, are following?
Well, I think it depends. There's a big difference between a mature product that has been around for a while, where you have certain KPIs, measures and metrics, and you're running tests to see how to, you know, improve the experience. That's the first thing. An emerging product, I think, with a new technique or a new technology, I think we need to have more caution, because you might not know what the measure or metric is. So engagement might look like a particular set of measures for one mature product, but now you've got something completely new. I would say healthcare applications are a really good example. Nobody expected that the gamification of, how many steps you'd done would work for some people, but after time, we saw that a lot of people use them and then it just drops like that. And the reason it drops like that is because for a lot of people, once they've got their baseline, they're sort of self-monitoring anyway. They don't need the technology anymore, right? So that was an emergent technical space which has grown, but the early assumptions, I think, were just a little bit off. Not to say that's not a great market, but it was just a little off. So I'd say mature products are different from emerging products. The second thing I want to say is that, and I wrote about this in my book on the data by design with Rochelle King and Caitlin Tan. When you're doing A/B tests to see whether an interface works or not, and you're testing essentially visual salience or interaction salience against a known flow that is high-value business for you and high-value business for your customers or users, that is very different from when you do an A/B test that fundamentally changes the nature of people's relationships with each other. So testing an interface, I think, is very different from testing a deep psychological connection. And there are examples that, I'm sure everybody is aware of. So how do you do this in your everyday context? When somebody's proposing a test, or somebody is proposing, new indicators, think hard. Don't just think because it's easy to do an A/B test across all features. All features should be tested in the same way. What are you changing? So that's where the ethical, reflective, conversive, and deep engagement comes in. The other thing I'd say is that try little experiments, small experiments, and try small experiments that mix qualitative and quantitative data that don't just take the KPIs, the measures, and the metrics as assumed and given. Engage explicitly with the design of the KPIs and the metrics. So when I talk about design your context and design your environment, I include that. Another great example is NPS, Net Promoter Score. Net Promoter Score, is about, would you recommend this to your friends? And then we decide whether this is high value or not. It's a useful measure. But when you start doing Net Promoter Score on every single minute of somebody's journey through your product, you actually are distorting the intent of the original metric. When you look at CLV, customer lifetime value, what does that mean? Does that mean value on both sides? It should, but it's often not interpreted to. When we think about engagement is another great one. I'll give you an example from way back at Yahoo. So the measure of engagement, this is 10 plus years ago, then, was, people clicking on things. How many clicks? We showed through the research we did with a video application called Zinc that actually deep engagement was when nobody was doing anything. There were no clicks because everyone was watching the video. It's obvious when you think about it. But, the PM we were working with at the time, the product manager, was basically, there's no engagement, there are no clicks. I'm like, well, my analogy for you is, imagine sitting next to somebody on a sofa and watching a movie, and they're talking all the time. What would you tell them to do? You would say, stop interacting with me. I'm watching the movie. So that was another way where we just, rethought the problem as to what the right measure or metric should be. And we actually looked at where the sessions were to say, this is what you should measure, and what a session should be redefined as whatever. Now, that was a long time ago, but it's just a small example. Does that answer?
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, good morning.
Hi.
Nice to see you. Thank you for an awesome talk. So I'm going to ask from the opposite things. So there's this various hats and various disciplines and so on. When I studied computer science, I just did algorithms. And there's a big change now happening. How? And especially as your very high involvement in ACM, how do we change a little bit from the education perspective? So it's not just about algorithm, or it's not just about design. There's this more kind of a stronger push to account for ethics, but also to speak with each other, to respect each other, to understand each other's view. How, for example, the ACM, and as part of this talk, in the context of recommendation, search, and everything, we need to change that?
We do need to change it. I think it's just going to be a lot of different approaches, attempts, so forth. This conference, lots of different expertise in this conference. Let's keep pushing for that. If you're in a team where you feel like you're the only person representing, more diversity, shall we say, try and bring that up, or go and find others who will help you bring it up. There's no simple solution, but awareness is growing, and at least we have an awareness, and we need to keep pushing for this more cross-disciplinary, more,
but also coming from the roots, like from universities, from like PhD program, graduate level, and all those kind of things. So this is even before you are kind of stuck eventually into the environment.
I agree. There's another area where I was just talking to Jonathan Lazar, who is an expert on accessibility. He came to Google to speak at my invitation, and he and I had a long conversation around, for example, I believe that accessibility shouldn't be an elective at the end of a course. It should be actually taught from the very beginning, and I believe that, and I do not have a degree in computer science, so you can all boo me off if you like. I am not an educator in computer science, but I do believe that these kinds of interdisciplinary conversations, ethics, things like making sure that equitable access, are taught, should be from the beginning, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
But
Yeah.
I'm happy to have a fight with anybody about that. I'm sorry. Carry on. Where are you?
Actually.
Oh, you're there.
Yes. I have a question regarding the kind of like the high stake recommendation versus the low stake recommendation. We build a system to use AI to teach students, and that's definitely every recommendation for the student task to take. Similarly, like in a medical situation where you are recommending things for a patient to do, those are very high stake. So what is your take in terms of as a designer and also as kind of like a product, focusing on the different type of matrix and so forth, the difference between a high stake recommendation, both from a development point of view and also from an algorithm point of view, what is your take on those?
What's my take on high stake versus low stake?
Well, in terms of differences from a designer's perspective.
I think, if I was thinking as it from an HCI perspective, I need to get into your domain and deeply understand the domain to see what might be high or low stakes. And here's I think there's a tendency in, certain kinds of engineering approach to go to the abstraction that will work, that will be the best for everybody, and leave the responsibility to the individual to figure it out. But if you sort of come from, an educational technology background, you're deep in the domain of education, and so you get to figure out high stake, low stake, and I think that's really important. So domain expertise has to come in. And if we think about socio-technical design has always talked about understanding the domain of application deeply, not the abstraction of something that is essentially a sort of a sub-tool within a bigger system, and you can apply it however you like. So, the role of the ethnographic investigation, the role of, deep domain learning before building something. When we think about the history of CSCW, computer-supported cooperative work, as, ACM conference, when we think about human-computer interaction, when we think about socio-technical engineering, systems engineering, all of those approaches really have emphasized that you need to understand the domain so that you can determine what is high and low consequence, what is critical and non-critical. safety, system safety, critical safety engineering. All of these emphasize what you're talking about. So my perspective on that is there is no answer to that. You need deep domain expertise, and you need to have participatory and observation of activity kinds of design practice. Most of the discretionary applications that we have did not come from that kind of reasoning. They came from a solution space, maybe a problem space, that was not validated, investigated, explored. And they did not come from a bigger exploration of the space in general. So I think we need to go back to doing that kind of socio-technical investigation, ethnographic field work, working with deep domain experts to help us understand those things.
Thank you very much. It's a great answer. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Yes.
Oh my goodness, there you are. You're still there. You are just this like halo here.
Actually, I have two questions. I'd like to hear your advice from your experience on two topics. Number one is I've seen in your slides, you mentioned designers, engineers, legal, and being a product manager myself, I'd like to hear from you about the role of product manager in this, especially in the context of things like recommender systems, and because you also touch on many things that I consider my job, like the problem space, the solution space, and making sure we're solving an existing problem. And
Yep.
the second question also is when we want to introduce AI-powered products or recommenders or whatever in areas that people did not see it there before. So like, for example, the personal assistant that's telling me what to do today. And then you hear user feedback like, no, I don't want somebody to tell me what to do. So how do you tackle such a problem that people would be more accepting and that we're really trying to help them by building these things and not trying to enforce some sort of an agenda on them?
I'm going to answer the second one first. How do you tell people? Well, giving somebody a product that they don't want, like, I have like speaking devices in my home, right? And sometimes I'm irritable with them and sometimes I'm not, right? But, so if my assistant tells me to do something and I don't want to, and it's again low consequence, I'm just like, whatever. I'm just going to ignore you. I think where it becomes really interesting and complicated is where we have competing interests. I'm going to give you an example, and this example is from Yvonne Rogers, who's an HCI expert and a friend. And she's been looking at assistant devices for the elderly. And there's a bunch of devices that caretakers of the elderly, typically their children, want their parents to have, which are about monitoring and assisting. And there are a whole bunch of elderly parents who are like just not having any of it, really, just not doing it. And I think what's interesting there is that it's actually based in the social relationship between parents and their children as the parents are aging. And those competing desires that I mentioned are surfaced in these technologies. And I think the social solution for that, it's not going to come from the device. The social solution from that is going to come between the negotiation between the parents and the children. It's like, you cannot monitor me to the point where I can't eat sausages anymore. It's just not going to happen. Now, if the device is provocative of that conversation, I think that might be productive, right? It gets more serious if you have a physician who feels that it's their ethical responsibility to make sure that this assistive device is used by the patient. That's a different kind of conversation. But I'm sort of escalating from the trivial me shouting at my talking devices through to actual healthcare. And so I think it has to get resolved in the social relationships within which these devices are operating and mediating. And some of those conversations are extremely productive. So as a provocateur, the assistant might be useful. Yeah. Now, to product management, and you're right, I didn't put PM on there, and I should have. You're absolutely right. Now, I've just recently started working more with an organization called Mind the Product, because I discovered a couple of years ago that my greatest allies in the engineering space were the PMs that I was working with, because I care about analytics and behavioral logging and A/B testing for human interaction and high-quality engagement. And most of the PMs I work with really care about analytics for system health. In my instance, it's material design system, which is Google's design system, health and uptake. And I have found that my greatest allies are the PMs who are really interested in socio-technical system health, because my team brings the social engagement, who is the user. We talk about the roadmap, where are we trying to go, what are we going to create in the future, what are the high, in the case of material design as a system, what are the components that are going to be important, how do we ensure accessibility. And so I'm really pleased you brought that up, and again, apologies for not putting that explicitly on the slide, because I actually think PM as a function really is absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. And in fact, I just wrote a couple of articles about this, which I'd be happy to to share if you had time and get your comments on, because I would love your feedback on this. Thanks.